Hello and welcome back to the Kerbal Space Program NASA Series reboot for the shakedown cruise of the Hermes Duna transfer vehicle. Cutting out the transfer out to Minmus because honestly it's really not much to watch, just me sitting in time acceleration for a little bit. Because of the inclination of Minmus, when I actually caught it, I was in a polar orbit, which is not too much of a big deal. Can actually be beneficial under certain circumstances, but really, the main purpose of this flight is to test out the vessel that will be taking the crew to and from Duna once I get Constellation underway. Just bring the orbit down a little lower over Kerbin's smallest moon. Burning and burning. It's actually, as I demonstrated in the last video, it's a lot more maneuverable than I would expect something of its mass to be, but with those two nuclear engines, it doesn't exactly have much in the way of acceleration. Still encountering the TAC life support bug, where Kerbals do not take life support on them for EVA, so that gives me about 2 minutes to do any types of EVA observations and get them back in the ship before they suffocate. Hermes itself does not have any science experiments on board. The only thing it can do are the crew-based experiments, crew report, EVA report, all that type of fun things. But still, quite a bit of science can be gleaned from such things. Further circularizing. I wasn't trying to go exactly circular, I just wanted to get things to a reasonable altitude because at one point I will have to drop part of the orbit down really low to get near Minmus science. So I wasn't being especially particular about my orbit. Getting a nice view of Minmus out there. Realize I'm still high over Minmus. And here's where I start to inspect my lander, and you notice the fuel lines don't actually connect to the engine underneath the Mark 1-2 pod anymore. So that means our attempted landing for Minmus is now a no-go. I was about to move the crew over to start planning for a descent, but had to scrub that. I'm going to probably attach a heat shield and try to bring that lander back. I will probably want to do some more redesigns because I want to minimize how much I have to use fuel lines. I think I might put some 0.625 meter engines underneath each one of those fuel tanks. With the landing a scrub, we're going to settle for a very low altitude pass over Minmus so we can get some EVA reports and crew reports. And while I could transmit those back with the communication systems on board Hermes, I figured I'm bringing everybody back anyway, so just going to go ahead and do it that way. Finally getting to collect some near Minmus science. I was really disappointed because I wanted this trip to actually have a manned landing on Minmus. It might be a while before I have VentureStar back in order, and it could be some time yet also before we get ready for a Duna transfer, so I think I can sneak another trip to Minmus out here. Hopefully that'll get me enough science to put me in range of finishing my VentureStar project. Then I can retire the space shuttle and all that fun stuff. And also, you know, give me a chance to land on Minmus. Since there's not a whole lot that can be done, cutting the mission short and coming straight back to Kerbin. Because mainly, I really want to get a good feel for how Hermes handles and what it can do in certain circumstances. So I'll be experimenting with aerobraking for this next section of the phase, trying to minimize delta V to get captured into Kerbin orbit. Kind of an abrupt transition there, but I actually had a crash at this point, and this is where I had the majority of my technical issues. I actually had to delete all the debris the game was tracking, and it seems to be running a lot more stable at this stage. Having fewer objects to track, that kind of makes some sense. Once I got things back up and running though, Hermes transferred onto a 43 kilometer intercept orbit with Kerbin that'll dip it through the atmosphere and hopefully not be too violent. I wanted to start off smooth and see the effects and then maybe dig a little deeper as I go along. Folding up the solar panels, retracting the omnidirectional antenna, and trying to fold the dish antenna back below what would be inside the shock cone of the spacecraft. It's a lot of mass, and so it can be a little deceptive. There are altitudes that I can pull off with smaller, lighter vessels without a problem, because they will decelerate quickly enough that they'll actually stop heating. Hermes has so much mass that it just continues to kind of punch through, and it doesn't really benefit too much from air resistance, which means things spend a lot longer at higher velocities, which puts an increased heat load on them. Kind of raises the chance of something exploding. So it's probably best to just kind of dip my toes in and take this slowly, one bit at a time. Definitely going to have to reinforce and beef up the structure a bit with some Kerbal Attachment System struts, because it's still a little wobbly. Transitioning through the atmosphere, you can see the apoapse is falling at a pretty decent rate, but nothing to really write home about. And I went ahead and went against my earlier intention, which was going to be to rendezvous with Hermes using Soyuz. I wanted to, since this is a test of what Hermes can do, I decided we will use it to make the rendezvous with Soyuz instead of the other way around. And that meant, once we got kicked back out for our second attempt at aerobraking, had to correct orbital inclination so it'd be in the same plane as the return craft. Trajectories mod being very useful for helping plan returns via aerobraking. It's our second pass through the atmosphere. And I wanted to experiment. I figured, because I wasn't running into much in the way of heating on those passes, I decided to lower the periaps by about 10 kilometers and see how that affected things. For another pass through the atmosphere, everything's tucked away where it won't be ripped off, hopefully. And started to experience some heating on this one. I actually started getting a little concerned here because the speed, as you can see, the surface velocity isn't really draining off all that quickly. And that means it's a lot of kinetic energy that's being converted to heat energy through the game, through deadly reentry simulating compressive shock heating. And unfortunately that was too much for the dipole antenna that guided the propulsion unit up. Also a bit too much for the omnidirectional antenna, even though it was folded away. But thankfully that's about as wild as things got. I can always install a different omnidirectional antenna. The main point of having that is I wanted to be able to use Hermes as a secondary communications relay when it's in orbit over Duna. I wanted it to be able to provide kind of backup communications ability for the ground mission. Even though it itself will be unmanned, I figured I can turn it into a comm satellite while it's up there. Make better use of it. Coming back around, I didn't actually change my periaps. I figured, because I would be losing so much velocity, that since I didn't lose anything after the dipole and the omnidirectional antenna, I didn't think I'd actually have the difficulty of losing anything else on the second pass through. However, you can see it's very lively in the handling department, trying to keep this thing on course. Because with all the mass towards the rear in that huge fuel tank, if this thing gets too far out of axis, it would have just gone tumbling. And so I was fighting I was pretty active on the controls trying to keep this thing pointed prograde. Because if it had tumbled, it would have pretty much disintegrated almost instantly, I'm certain. You see the nose is starting to lift up a bit. Trying to fight against it with RCS and reaction wheels. And at this point, I went full pitch down and just barely caught it before it tumbled. And at that stage, I made the decision to raise my periaps up. I don't think I'm going to be aero braking much with Hermes in the future. I would rather make multiple safe passes braking with the engines than take the chance of something of it breaking up on re-entry. Thankfully, that pass brought our APOFs down enough. It was effective, but it was just too dangerous for me to want to try anything like it again. So, brought our periaps down. I made one more orbit and was able to time the rendezvous so I could get within 300 meters of the Soyuz combo craft that's parked in orbit. Because of Hermes' low acceleration, I decided to make sure I got into physics range, but otherwise was just going to halt my relative velocity and then make the rest of the rendezvous with the Soyuz. It's a pretty nimble, huge, honking spacecraft, but I didn't want to ask too much of it. It only dawned on me after how lucky I was that none of those solar arrays burned up on re-entry, so definitely going to be avoiding aero braking for the foreseeable future. With only one engine active on the twin Soyuz craft, was able to get reasonably close to Hermes, bleed off that velocity. Make sure the omnidirectional antenna is deployed on both craft. I didn't want to undock and lose signal. Would have been a simple matter of redocking to reacquire signal, but I really just didn't want to deal with that. Command and undocking right as the sun rises over Kerbin's horizon. For once, I've actually timed intricate orbital maneuvers while the sun is out. So hopefully things are definitely more illuminated than they typically are. And once again, this is all normal speed. I'm very happy with my design with Hermes because it's big. I think it looks impressive looking, but it doesn't have so many parts on it that it just craters the frame rate, because I've got 3 reasonably complicated spacecraft in the frame here, and I was still getting about 24 frames a second, so rather enjoyable compared to trying to dock the space shuttle to the International Space Station I've got up there. The first Soyuz gets hard locked. I have to hunt this guy to find Hermes. Disorienting sometimes. Select the correct docking port. And I rotated this one 180 degrees out from the other one so that their omnidirectional antennas would miss each other and still not collide with Hermes itself. I'm probably going to have an Orion analog type vessel built for the actual Duna transfer bit, but I don't want to have Orion flying until I've at least got Venture Star running, because if I remember correctly, Orion was originally not even planned until after they canceled Venture Star, but it's still a very useful concept for moving a crew, say from the ground to the space station and from the ground to Hermes, without wasting a lot of parts that I end up throwing away with Soyuz. Although, truth be told, I'm very, very happy with the way my Soyuz capsule came out. It's now the second largest space station in orbit around Kerbin. And at the same time has the largest crew. There are only 4 Kerbals on board the KSS, while we've got 6 hanging out around here. So I had to take a moment to drop any extra RCS out of the Soyuz capsules into the Hermes ship, because at this stage if I brought all that monopropellant back, it was just going to get lost when I eject the service modules. So might as well put it to use. I also ended up transferring quite a bit of fuel over, not enough to really top off, not near enough to top off Hermes, because it got to about 48% fuel from going to Minmus and back, and that's with some really inefficient maneuvering. I just wanted to see what type of longevity this has. Long story short, it's pretty incredible. So, but it did go up from 48% to about 50%, so that's definitely worth having. I locked the fuel tank so I wouldn't accidentally bump shift key and send it rocketing off into nowhere. But before I can move the crews into the capsules proper using crew transfer, I had to grab all the science data and pack it aboard. Really wish I had the F-Science mod at this time. It would have been very useful. It's one I've used in the past. The first crew to depart is the science and engineering crew. Although in this case, I guess they would all be engineers. And a deorbit burn for our first Soyuz. And I probably could have transferred quite a bit more fuel out, but oh well. Wanted to make sure these guys got back. Separating the living quarters from the service module. A little bit of re-entry heating, nothing too drastic though. Doing a re-entry at night can sometimes be a little frightening, especially if you check the map and you're coming down in mountainous terrain. But reasonably safe landing. Just a little bumpy. We get our first 3 Kerbals returned from Minmus. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, we start moving the flight crew over to the second Soyuz craft. And at a later date, I'll be sending up a servicing mission so I can refuel, resupply, and generally refurbish the Hermes. I'm probably going to build a... Well, this would actually be a perfect mission for the space shuttle now that I think of it, because I need to bring up some of those KAS strut points, need to bring up supplies, fuel, all that fun stuff. So I may actually send the space shuttle up to rendezvous with Hermes so we can do that, you know, pre-departure refurbishment. Unfortunately, since I ejected this a little bit lower, with the higher drag, the crew pod was getting pushed back into the habitation module. Had to take advantage of some of the aerodynamic characteristics of a re-entering pod. Unfortunately, just had the antenna blow off. Had a much lower periaps on this one because I just wanted to see how much heating I could put this thing through. But once safely through the transonic, or through the shock heating barrier, I think it's altitude based, even in Ferrum and Deadly Reentry together. And safe landing is had by all. On this mission, we were able to acquire 104 science points, which is nothing to sneeze at. Brought back all our crew, and for the next video, we're going to start off by returning the crew from the KSS. They've been up here quite a while. They'd probably like to come home. So until then, stay tuned, and thank you very much for watching.